What's going on, y'all? This is X and welcome to another YouTube video. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about why I'm kind of throwing away my Sony A7 III, not really, and replacing it with the Sony A6400. So if you are interested in the reasons why I'm switching to the A6400, please be sure to stick around. Have B-Cam active. If you guys can determine which camera is which, either one could be the Sony A7 III or the Sony A6400. Please drop a comment, let me know which one you think, which one is which. And if you make it to the end of the video, I will let you guys know which camera is the Sony A6400 and which camera is the Sony A7 III. So let's get right into the video. So I had a few people asking me, why did you get the Sony A6400 after you've been using the Sony A7 III for so long? And really the reason is there's not one camera in the world, in my opinion, that does it all. So you kind of need to have different cameras for different reasons. And ultimately the reason why we have cameras is so that we can use them as tools to tell stories. So the fact that my Sony A7 III doesn't do it all, or at least in my opinion, I don't think it does it all, is the reason why we went ahead and got the Sony A6400. So now the question is, what was the Sony A7 III lacking and what made me pick up the Sony A6400? So as you guys may or may not know, I've just started a podcast on my channel. The podcast name is the Red Eye Podcast. Go ahead and check it out. I'll drop a link in the description. But ultimately, a big reason why I wanted to get the Sony A6400 was because of the record limit. On the Sony A6400, there is absolutely no record limit, which means that you can start the camera and just kind of go about your recording and not have to worry about the recording turning off. Now with the Sony A7 III, the record limit is set to 30 minutes. So if I want to do a podcast with the Sony A7 III, I would have to essentially take a break in the middle of it and stop the camera, or I would have to connect it to my computer and kind of screen record the computer screen instead of using the raw file from the camera. Now, ultimately, that wasn't a complete deal breaker because, you know, it's not a huge deal that I would have to, you know, kind of record my screen monitor, but at the same time it is an inconvenience, and it was just one of the reasons why I decided that I wanted to pick up another camera to help with my kind of issues that I was having with the Sony A7 III. The second reason why we went ahead and picked up the Sony A6400 was because it does have that flip out screen and the form factor is a lot lighter. And just so you guys know, I'm not the only person who uses these cameras. My girlfriend, she actually has a YouTube channel herself with 40,000 subscribers, so go ahead and subscribe to her. Her YouTube channel is youtube.com/Naomi Marie, so go ahead and check her out. She was actually the first guest on the podcast, so check out the first episode if you haven't seen that as well. So in efforts to kind of kill two birds with one stone, you know, we got the flip out screen so that she can use while she's recording her vlogs, and I get my no record limit so that when we do the podcast, I don't have to worry about checking the camera, and you know, the screen will flip up so I can see if anything happens, if the camera overheats or anything, you know, I can tell immediately if something went wrong. And essentially, the camera won't shut off unless the battery goes dead or I run out of storage. So the Sony A6400 has replaced my Sony A7 III in a few ways, but not really. And the reason why I say that is because for all my client work and somewhat professional work that I do, I use the Sony A7 III. And the reason why I use the Sony A7 III is because it is truly a professional camera. The screen doesn't tilt all the way up like the Sony A6400, but the thing is, I'm behind the camera anyway, so I really don't ever have to do that, if that makes sense, because I'm kind of either shooting the music video or doing some kind of photography where I'm behind the camera. And also it's a full frame camera. So with that being said, you get all the advantages that the full frame camera kind of gives you. So if you're not familiar, the Sony A6400 is an APS-C crop sensor, which means that, let's say I'm using a 16mm lens on the Sony A6400. If I wanted to use a 16mm lens on the Sony A6400 and have that equate to a full frame sensor, then really I'm at 24mm on a full frame body. To make that make more sense, think of it this way. If I'm using a Sony A6400, I have to be mindful that whatever focal length I'm using, I have to multiply that by 1.5. So I'll actually become closer to my subject if I'm using the Sony A6400. Now, that could be a pro and a con for you, depending on, you know, what side of the fence you sway on. Like if you like to use telephoto lenses that, you know, let's say you're using a 100 to 400 something, then you may want that extra 1.5 because it'll give you 1.5 more times your focal length. So if you were at 400, then you would be at 600. You know what I mean? And if you were to use that same lens on a full frame camera, then you would be at just 400 because it's a full frame. So I kind of went off on a tangent there, but the main thing I'm trying to say to you guys is this: there's almost never a situation where there's one camera that does it all. So you got to be able to use different tools to your advantage. And in this case, the Sony A6400 has filled that gap for me and for my girlfriend's purposes for creating content. Now, is the Sony A6400 better than the Sony A7 III? Well, it all depends on what you're trying to do. So, you know, I can't be the one to tell you that, but at the end of the day, the Sony A6400 is about half the price of the Sony A7 III. And the current lens that I have on the Sony A7 III is the 24-105 f4. It was about $1,200. So this whole setup that I got right here is a little under $3,500, you know, for the camera and lens. Now, if you go with the Sony A6400 setup, you're going to be spending a lot less, and depending on what you're trying to do, you know, it may work out better for you. In my case, I kind of need both cameras for what I'm trying to do. I know it sucks, but at least I have an A cam and I have a B cam, depending on, you know, what I'm shooting. So with that being said, I hope this helps. You know, you don't always need the best, you know, the most expensive camera to do what you're trying to do. You need to look at your use case and figure out, hey, what am I trying to shoot? What's going to make the most sense, and how do I tell the story the best? And if you can do that with the tools that you already have, then great. If not, then you may have to add to your repertoire of tools. I never use that word. Why am I using that word? But anyway, I'm gonna show you guys some of the differences in the camera quality, some of the dynamic range, the color science. The reason why I went with Sony is because, of course, the color science should be about the same or similar. And I'm used to the menu system, although a lot of people say that the menu system is not that great. I'm used to it, so it doesn't really bother me. So I'm gonna take these cameras outside. I'm gonna show you guys what they look like, compare the two, and I'll let you decide, should I get the Sony A7 III or should I get the Sony A6400? And although I'm looking at this one, you know, this may or may not be the Sony A6400. And although I'm looking at this camera and saying the Sony A6400, this could be the Sony A7 III that I'm pointing at. And this one could be the Sony A6400. You guys decide. I'll let you know at the end of the video. But anyway, let's step outside and show you guys the differences between the two different cameras from a real life kind of outdoorsy situation environment. Let's get it. You know, everything looks pretty good. I had to use manual settings for this. I trust manual settings more. If you're a photographer and you don't use manual settings, I'd recommend trying to learn how to use manual. It just gives you a better picture once you get the hang of it. But one thing that I have to really get used to is definitely the flip out screen. I keep looking at it, and I know I should be looking at the lens, but I keep looking at the flip out screen. So that's one of the things you got to get used to. But it is nice having it because you can immediately see if your exposure is off or if anything is off. You can just kind of easily check and see. But yeah, I'll be switching back and forth between this camera and the Sony A7 III. I'm using the internal microphone that these cameras have. That way you can get an idea of the microphone quality as well. If you do hear wind in the background, that is why. I decided not to set up the Rode for this one or for the A7 III. That way you guys kind of get a true test. Also, another thing to keep in mind of is on this camera, you can't really put the microphone on top of the camera in the mount space while you're recording with the flip up screen up. So you will have to get another attachment to allow the microphone and the flip up screen to be kind of active at the same time, which isn't a big deal, but just something to keep mind of while you're, you know, thinking about getting this camera or not. So this is the Sony A6400, and I'm going to flip over to the Sony A7 III. Now I am on the Sony A7 III, still using 4K settings. The Sony A6400 I was recording in 4K. This camera I'm also recording at 4K. Different, you know, as far as the setup, I can't see myself. I'm looking right into the lens, which is what I'm used to anyway. But, you know, just to give you guys kind of a field of view of what it looks like. I set up the cameras pretty much identical with the manual settings. So you shouldn't see too much of a difference, but I do notice that the Sony A7 III is a bit more heavy. I'm not using a GorillaPod or tripod to kind of hold it. So if I'm walking around like this, I'm, you know, literally just holding it by the lens. If I'm walking around like this, my arm will get, you know, tired after time. But don't do what I'm doing. Definitely get you a GorillaPod. I left mine in my other place. Right now I have 2 places, so going back and forth. But anyway, of course the quality is going to be great. Sony A7III, it's a fantastic camera. It just comes down to the decision on, you know, would you pay more for this one or would you go with the other one? And it all depends on your use case. Like for me, it makes sense to have both. At certain times, the A6400 is better than this camera, and at times, you know, the A7III is better than the A6400. So just kind of perspective there. But you know, the 2 main big differences are, and this is a full frame sensor. Sony A6400 is an APS-C sensor, which is cropped. So I'm recording at a focal length of 24 millimeters right now. On the Sony A6400, I was recording at a focal length of 16 millimeters. So if you incorporate that crop factor of 1.5 to that 16 millimeter, essentially we're both recording at 24 millimeters on both cameras. So everything should be basically identical. Sorry if there's a bunch of wind in the background, but I am using the internal microphone. That way you guys get the kind of raw audio input, raw video. I'm not using any ND filters at all. So this is everything fresh out the camera, you know. So let me know, what do you think looks better? Or if they look about the same. All right, now that we're back inside, hope you guys were able to get a lot out of that demonstration showing both of the cameras and how they kind of, you know, compare to one another. Also, one more thing, the battery life on the Sony A7III is fantastic. It's not the same for the Sony A6400. So if you're someone who's looking to get the Sony A6400 and you plan on shooting long days, just make sure that you buy a second battery, which isn't a huge deal, especially if you're, you know, the cost for the Sony A6400 is already half the cost of a Sony A7III. So you got to look at it that way, you know, whatever makes the most sense for you. But do know that whenever I shoot music videos or do anything with the Sony A7 III, I never have to worry about a backup battery. Not so much the case with the Sony A6400. So just throwing that out there, you know, be aware that the battery life is not nearly as good on the Sony A6400 as it is on the Sony A7 III. But with that being said, if you guys have made it all the way to the end of the video, I'm about to tell you which camera is which. So drum roll, please. So the Sony A6400 is the camera that I'm currently looking at. That is the Sony A6400. And the camera that is the A camera is the Sony A7 III. So in my opinion, they both look very similar. Like I can't tell the difference, especially when they're under kind of similar, you know, circumstances. The environments are both kind of similar. Can't really tell the difference. So if that has helped at all, please let me know. Drop a comment, drop a like, and subscribe. Also check out the podcast. It's on Spotify. It's also on YouTube, the video version. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.